Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we are going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. So we've just finished looking at the games of Emanuel Lasker, the second world champion, and now we are looking at the games of Carl Schlechter, who he was a Austro-Hungarian chess master and a very strong chess master. Actually, he's not that well known today, but he's very strong. He fought Lasker. He had a match with Lasker in 1910, and he was actually winning the match at one point, but unfortunately he made a blunder in one of the later games, and it ended up being a draw. That match did. So Lasker kept the title by default. He has a lot of notable tournament victories as well. Unfortunately, he passed away during World War One, but certainly a very strong player. His opponent, I believe, is pronounced Georg Marco. He has the black pieces, and I believe he was a Viennese chess player. But Schlechter started off by playing d4. d5, c4, going into the Queen's Gambit. Now, in the last game, we had quite a bit of analysis on the Queen's Gambit, looking at c6 and e6, and in the last game we had c6. This game, we've got e6, which was the usual and most common way to meet the Queen's Gambit at the time. The Queen's Gambit declined, so we're leaving the option to play c5 in one move, but accepting slightly less space by playing e6 and accepting that this bishop is going to be slightly limited. Now we have knight c3, controlling the e4 square, hoping to try and get e4 in at some point. Knight f6, controlling the e4 square still. Reti does comment that c5 has been tried and was recommended by Tarrasch at one point. This is the Tarrasch defense. However, this has been found to be not that good, because after c takes d5, e takes d5, black's almost certainly going to end up with a isolated pawn on d5, and they're not really going to be able to control the square in front of the pawn. So instead, perhaps trying to take here first may be a better move that Reti proposes, because if you take here and then you play c5, then there's no risk of you having a isolated pawn, because this pawn's been exchanged for the c4 pawn. So in the game, however, we had knight f6, bishop to g5, bishop to e7. Again, Reti gives another variation as knight b to d7. And it's worth noting, c takes d5, e takes d5. You can't win this piece, because you might think the knight's pinned, so it can't be taken. Except knight takes d5, and you're going to end up a piece down. Bishop to b4 check, and the only defense is queen blocks. After bishop takes, king takes, black is just up a piece. So knight b to d7 is one potential way to try and help resolve this pin slightly, and it doesn't lose a pawn after you analyze it a bit further. But in the game we saw bishop e7. We then had e3, castles, knight f3, knight b to d7, and now rook c1. And Reti comments that this move, rook c1, presents black with a problem. So black doesn't really want to exchange on c4 until after white has moved his bishop. So if white played bishop d3 now, black may then want to take on c4, because in recapturing the pawn, white has to move the bishop twice. So black's taking the pawn without a loss of tempo. However, with rook c1, black has a bit of an issue in that he hasn't really got too many strong moves left. It's quite difficult to find a good solid move for black, essentially a move that allows black to wait a tempo or two until white develops their light square bishop to take this pawn. However, Reti also comments that white hasn't really got many good moves either. Bishop d3 is one of the only moves that white has left. Now in a game, we see a6. Now b6, Reti says, was played slightly more often, intending obviously bishop b7 and also supporting c5. And c6, I believe, has also been played. However, after c5, b6, b4, a5. Actually, we're going to come back to this variation, but c6 has been played before as well. Now, a6 is played here, hoping that after you take, the bishop takes, you can then play b5 and develop the bishop. That's the general aim here. However, actually, this game by Schlechter, according to Reti, was at one point considered to have actually refuted this whole a6 idea. Now it's been played and revised many times since, and I think it is still playable currently. But this game was quite iconic in that people thought for some time that this a6 idea didn't work because of this game. Now after a6, we see c5. And this is quite an important moment. White's gaining space with this c5 move. Now, if instead we saw something like bishop d3, then black would have a good game, according to Reti, because after the pawn takes, the bishop takes, and then b5, the bishop retreats, bishop b7, with c5 to come, and black's about to free up their position. They've got their bishops now open. They've got a freer game. Black's got no issues here. Now, also, if instead of bishop d3, white had played c5 instead, then we would see something like b6 and then a5, and white's going to struggle to hold on a bit here. However, after c5, what we see now is b5, and here Georg Marco is essentially saying that he's happy for the queen side to stay closed. And what this means is that this bishop is going to struggle to get into the game. All of black's pawns are on the light squares, and how is black really going to get any pawn breaks? There aren't really any. Black's going to really struggle to bring this bishop into the game. He's resigning himself to have far less space. It's worth noting in this position, b6 isn't actually possible, because after c6 is a threat by white, and after knight to b8, something like knight e5 might come, and this pawn is just wedged in here. And look at black's development now. His knight has been undeveloped, and it has just literally no development on the queen side. So b6 there isn't possible. Instead, something like c6 followed by b6 may well be the better option. But in the game, we saw c5 followed by b5, accepting the closed queen side and this inactive bishop. And now we see b4, defending the c5 pawn, c6, bishop to d3, and now a5. So the entire queen side closed. White was able to develop this bishop without any loss of tempo, and now black is hoping to try and open up this a file for his rook. However, Reti comments that this isn't quite sufficient, because after something like a3, b takes a takes b, a takes b, black has the a file, but that's it. That's the only real method of counterplay that black has. And white's going to be able to get quite a nice attack going against the black king side. And this counterplay that black has on the a file is just too far away. So what he says instead is, if black had tried to do the main idea of c6 and then b6, possibly after b4, a5 as well, then black will end up having two open files, and that extra file being open may be enough for him to have some counterplay. But here we see a5, and this isn't quite sufficient. Now we have a3, rook to e8, castles, and now knight to h5. And Reti comments that this is an error. Black needed to really cover this backwards pawn before he went moving his knight. And we'll see why now. What we see is bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, now knight to e5, attacking this pawn. We see knight takes e5, and now bishop takes h7. Now here we see king f8. If perhaps the queen took, you'd have something like queen takes h5, check, king g8, and d takes e5, and white's a pawn up with this open h file which the queen's ready to use. If king h8, then obviously queen takes h5, and if this knight moves away, let's say it moves to d7 where it's nice and safe, we've actually got a mate in 4. Bishop e4 check, king g1, queen h7, and then queen h8. So the knight's essentially forced to play something like knight to g4, trying to perhaps get into h6, but even then, after something like bishop c2 check, knight h6, the mate's defended, but again, white's the one with the initiative on the king side, and white's also a pawn up. So after this sacrifice, black declines it. He plays king f8, and now we see queen takes h5, and now knight to c4, jumping into this nice little outpost. Bishop to d3. Oh, sorry, and when I was saying about this pawn being undefended, it's because this knight jumped in there attacking the pawn. So if they didn't want to lose the pawn and potentially lose some of the more of their position, they had to take the knight here. So after bishop to d3, we saw queen f6, bishop takes c4, removing that quite strong knight. B takes c4, b5 is what we see. And now we see bishop to d7. Now, black has a passed pawn, however, white also has a knight posted in front of the passed pawn, which is the best blockading piece there is. So here we see b5. Now if c takes b5, knight takes b5, this knight's going to come into d6. And yes, black's going to pass pawn, but so is white, except white will have a knight posted on d6, and the knight will just be dominating the entire black position. And this bishop, which still hasn't moved, will still have almost no scope whatsoever, and it will never be able to challenge its knight because of the weaknesses in the dark squares around the opponent's position. So instead, we see black playing bishop to d7. After b takes c6, another variation might be worth considering is b6, and this is still winning, but it's perhaps not quite as accurate or as active because the position's going to stay closed, and it's going to be a bit more of a long, drawn-out game for White. White's going to find it a bit more difficult to try and break through and force a win. They're going to have to play quite slowly and very gradually, very cautiously take advantage of their kingside pawn majority. Which is why we see b takes c6 instead. Bishop takes c6 and now b1, and now White is the one with control of the open file. Now here we see g6, trying to push the queen away, but after queen h6 check, king e7, Black, I suspect, probably thought that his king would be safe here when he played g6. You don't play g6 without first seeing this very obvious check and king e7. So Black probably thought his king would be quite safe here. It's in the centre, but it's surrounded by quite a nice few pawns. It's got a rook and a queen defending it. It doesn't look that it's that dangerous. However, Schlechter will prove that this isn't actually the case. And it's worth noting, though, even after king g8, Black's king isn't exactly that safe anymore either. White's going to be able to get some quite easy counterplay against the king in this position. But instead we see king e7. Now rook b6, attacking the bishop on c6. King to d7, defending. Now queen to h3. And White is threatening queen g3 to go into here, which would win the bishop and would just infiltrate in the position. So we see queen g5, preventing any queen g3. And now rook f to b1, doubling up on the open file. Rook to h8, attacking the queen. Queen to f3, attacking this pawn, and now f5. And now Schlechter is able to break through Black's defences with quite a nice little combination. We see rook takes c6, king takes c6, and now knight takes d5. And then we see rook a to b8. If e takes d5, obviously the queen's defending so the king can't take. E takes d5, then we'd see rook b6. This is the variation Reti gives. And after king c7, queen takes d5. It's now just mate in 6, and that includes Black just sacrificing the queen on g2. Some potential options if, say, Black tries to challenge the open file. This would just result in a quick mate. Rook c6, king b7, queen d7 is mate. If Black tries to just retreat the king, again, rook c6 check. Let's say king b7, queen d7, king b8, rook b6, mate. So e takes d6 is rook b6 here. This would be mate in 6. And that's only delayed with moves like queen takes g2 check. So Black doesn't take the knight. Black doesn't take the knight. Instead, he plays rook a to b8, trying to get some counterplay on this file, challenging White's open file. And also, if White just does nothing, then it's going to be mate in 1. Now here we see knight f6, knight f4 check. Discovered check against the king. King to d7 is played, and now rook to b7, defended by the queen. Rook takes, queen takes b7, king to e8, and now we see c6, and in this position Black resigns. So let's have a look at what was threatened. Let's just say Black plays a random move like rook h6. Then after queen d7 check, king f8, knight takes e6 check, king g8, queen g7 is mate. So that was the threat after c6. The computer gives queen e7, which is a logical move to try and defend this 7th rank. However, after queen c8 check, queen d8, because obviously the king moves and you're losing the rook. So queen d8, queen takes e6 check, king f8, knight takes g6 check, king to g7, and knight takes h8 is then going to quite easily win. Because after here, queen e5, oh, sorry, that's how are you going to defend this pawn? So with this, with the threats of the different mates, with the threat of being able to queen this pawn in 2 moves, and with white having essentially fully infiltrated with the black king being in the centre, and black having no real counterplay, Georg Marco resigned in this position. So there we have it. That was the 31st game of the series, but game number 1 of Carl Schlechter. And I do hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I went on YouTube and YouTubed how to pronounce his name, and I repeated it a few times, but I'm not too confident I got it right. But yeah, that's game number 31. And we saw again some more ideas in the Queen's Gambit, and perhaps some of the risks of trying to wait for this bishop to move before you capture the pawn. However, as I noted, a6 is a move which is still played today. It's the second most common move in this position. The most common is c6, but it is still played today, and it arguably has a better defense, a better win rate than c6. I've just got chess.com's master games open here, and a6, 23% wins for black, 32% wins for white, whereas c6 is 39% wins for white to 13% wins for black. So there's definitely some merit to a6. It's still played it today now and again, but yeah, that's what we saw. I hope you like this game. I think we've got a few more of Carl Schlechter. I think there's 3 games of his. So if you liked it, please like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.